What World War II game had the cast of Band of Brothers voice the main characters? Call of Duty: The Big Red One. Which game cast Mark Hamill to narrate the military channel footage between missions? The Big Red One. Which World War II shooter was the first to really try and emphasize a character-driven story? That would also be Call of Duty 2: The Big Red One. The Big Red One is a game I have very specific memories playing as a kid on my dad's original Xbox. I remember that I liked playing it. I remember getting stuck at one very specific section in a dark graveyard. And I remember that this game, Medal of Honor Frontline, and catching an episode of Band of Brothers with my dad created an intense fascination with World War II in a little 6-year-old me. So going back and experiencing this game in its entirety as a 26-year-old was a very different experience. And it stirred up a range of different thoughts as I played. From how good of a game I think this is, to how grateful I am for modern game controls, and how I think it reflects on modern Call of Duty, and some thoughts on things I feel Treyarch could have done better to make this game better now that I've beaten it. So it's time to look at the Call of Duty game you may have forgotten, Call of Duty 2: The Big Red One. For 2005, this was a long campaign. At least, it was much longer than I thought it was going to be as I headed in to play it. I was very surprised at the number of missions, the length of each of these missions, and the variety of locations they take you to. I was totally expecting this to be a short campaign that I could blow through relatively quickly. But getting into review mode, I wanted to start with how I very much appreciate what this Call of Duty was trying to do with its theme. Highlighting a revered military unit that put their lives on the line over and over again throughout the world's most deadly conflict. This is a genius way to approach a World War II game. Unfortunately though, I feel that this focus is kind of lost in the moment-to-moment telling of the story. And I know this is an older game that was working with the limitations of the hardware at the time, but I found it pretty hard to focus on or truly care about the cast of characters during my playthrough. Individual moments of banter were pretty funny and definitely helped keep things interesting and remind me of the game's purpose, but I often found it tough to remember each of the squad members' names. With this squad from the Big Red One being the whole focus of the narrative, it doesn't speak well that I had so little interest in this aspect while I was moving through the game. And I don't think it was just a lack of focus from me, because the game also just kind of ends. There is no traditional story arc to be found here. It's a collection of in-mission objectives that carry you and this squad through various locations and battles. The concept of following the Big Red One and then focusing on a fictional set of troops from this unit, and how the entire game is themed around this premise, it really implies that we'd see an actual narrative that sees these characters develop and change throughout the game. And there really isn't much of that to be found here. The squad sees some losses along the way, and those are meant to be important pivot points in the story, but without much other substance to back this up, these moments inevitably fall kind of flat, leaving the cast not super memorable. But given that this game was a 2005 release and deep narratives weren't exactly the norm yet in FPS genre, this game kind of gets a pass for lack of a deeper narrative than the objective-based worldwide romp that we are provided with here. It's still a very enjoyable experience even today, with the gameplay that holds up well and a ton of interesting variety in locales and backdrops to the repetitive mission objectives. It's just barely enough to shake things up throughout the surprisingly long playtime, but this takes me in a certain aspect of the gameplay that I had some trouble with and need to talk about. With this game being almost a decade old, of course the control scheme was gonna be a bit wonky compared to modern games. But this being a first-person shooter, I figured it'd still mostly make sense with what I anticipated. No. I immediately had issues figuring out what the controls were, as there were some things that were very different from all modern shooters. I mean, X was the toss grenade button, which I found out in the worst way possible. Okay, so X is the grenade button, and I think I accidentally grenaded a teammate and I failed. But I'm not entirely certain if how that happened. Also, I found it very odd that crouching up and crouching down were two different buttons. This is really baffling to me because, I mean, I get that this game is old, but even games before this one used the same button to toggle crouch down and crouch back up. Like, Halo Combat Evolved came out in 2001. And we all know that Call of Duty seemed to take at least some inspiration from that control scheme. So why change some of those very intuitive controls? X for grenade rather than reload, D-pad to change weapons instead of Y, B to crouch is the same, but in COD they use Y as crouch up and the jump button. It really doesn't make much sense why in 2005 they built a control scheme like this. I honestly had no clue you were provided with two weapons until roughly halfway through the game. I didn't think to hit the D-pad for anything, and when I did, I just randomly found out that I had always been carrying an alternative weapon that I could have been switching to. But with all that being said, the controls could be worse. At the end of the day, this is still an FPS game. As long as the thumbsticks allow you to look and move intuitively and the right trigger is to shoot, we're in business. It just baffled me the way that some of the buttons were laid out, given that there were games that did this much better even before this one. So it being old doesn't exactly give it a pass here. It just felt like bad decision making. So playing this Call of Duty game from 2005, when this juggernaut of a series was in its infancy, I couldn't help but think about where these games went from this point, and what they may have taken from the Big Red one. I felt that the gameplay here was a little stiff, but it did make me realize that while the new Call of Duty games are faster, smoother, and more movie-like, the core gameplay of shooting guys and this unique style of weapon and ammo management is still very much the same all these years later. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing. I mean, this is still a first-person shooter. They all operate in just about the same way. But it really can be a bit shocking playing a game that's 20 years old and feeling firsthand how similar it plays to its most recent iteration. So I was playing the original Xbox version of this game, but on my Xbox 360. While I assume that it still played smoother on the 360 than it would have on the original Xbox, there were still fairly significant frame rate drops in busy sections where there was a lot going on. But as I took note of this, I actually felt like it kind of worked as a good representation of the chaos in the battle I was in. I almost think that this is something newer Call of Duty games should add. Not necessarily like incorporating forced frame rate drops. PC players would go absolutely nuts. But adding some sort of on-screen effect to represent chaos in hectic situations could be a really cool inclusion for a Call of Duty game. And it's kind of something these old games did by accident. Also, going back to the early days of COD, I really do miss the way these games would include real footage of World War II when providing context of the battles that you, the player, would be partaking in. Even the modern Call of Duty games that do take place in a historical context really don't use old footage or any other material in order to enhance the narrative. The best we get these days are the cutscenes in Black Ops games that depict the past presidents. The way the Big Red one approaches telling a war story is damn near everything I want in a story-based video game in terms of setting up a premise and having a strong narrative foundation. Someone creating a game like this, but with the Vietnam War as the main conflict, is exactly the sort of thing I was asking for in my "Why Aren't There Any Vietnam Games" video. All of our modern military shooters are all attempting to be huge, fictitious, blockbuster events. It's a big game of one-upmanship with themselves and their competing franchises. Mix that with the encroachment of microtransactional multiplayer modes and various random crossovers, and you've got Black Ops 6. Getting a modern game with modern storytelling capabilities following a historically accurate group of soldiers through the real battles of a historical conflict would be really refreshing for the industry at this point. Yeah, in 2006, the World War II concept was very much starting to fatigue. But today, we're over all of the mediocrity and lack of soul in games. Getting something like the Big Red one in a modern context would be amazing. So another thing I just have to discuss when it comes to the Big Red one is that I happened to end up with the collector's edition of the game when I picked it up from my local game store. And it was pretty neat to see some special features and videos specific to the collector's edition disc. But there was one bonus video in particular called The Men of the Big Red One. And oh my god, this changed my entire outlook on this whole game in the world. Weren't these clips of Treyarch conducting interviews with the real members of this division included in the cutscenes between missions? I mean, I get they were trying to tell a fictional story with these characters that they created that were just supposed to embody the Big Red One. But like I said before, playing this game without that context, I found it pretty tough to get invested in the characters and what was happening to them throughout the campaign. It all kind of just felt disjointed. Like the game was more about the gameplay and the feeling that it gives to the player rather than the story taking place. But after beating the game, and then coming across this video, I found myself caring deeply about the way this game really tried to tell the stories and respect the men that lived through these battles. Like, one of these soldiers recounts his story from the Normandy beach landing.
I finally got out of the water. I made it up almost to the shale wall, and I got hit with some shrapnel, knocked me down. Of course, the rules were you don't stop for anybody. So the other guys were running right by me, you know. And the fire was just completely intense. I got belted 4 or 5 times. And the tide is coming in. And this is hard to talk about, believe me. And I'm gonna drown. And I'm trying to keep my head out of the water because it's coming right over my head, you know. Finally, somebody came down from this shale area. Turned out it was my buddy, you know. And he couldn't budge me. Now, he came down on the fire, too. He went back, and they got another guy from Chicago. And he came down, and they cut my jacket off with a trench knife. I survived because of him when a lot of my good friends were killed.
And this is how the beach landing more or less unfolds in the campaign. Treyarch used these stories throughout the campaign to depict the reality of war from those who lived it. It would have been so much better to play through the campaign knowing about and hearing about these stories from the men that lived them. It was this feeling of respect for sacrifice that Treyarch was trying to capture when making the game all about the Big Red One. The experience they've made to try and create that feeling ends up landing so much stronger when we hear these men tell their stories. We then care about their experiences and ponder about all the others that were lost on the battlefield. Building that emotional attachment with this aspect of the campaign before setting off on the journey would have made literally everything that came after it much more meaningful. And I don't know, it feels like this Call of Duty game just kind of flies under the radar when compared to the other titles in this legendary franchise. But man, going back and experiencing this one was such a treat. Especially my, albeit late, discovery of the Men of the Big Red One bonus video. It really made me realize how important making stories like this can be. With this game, there was an intention to immortalize the stories of the Men of the Big Red One, and that's really special. And playing this game really makes me think that more story-based games should set out to achieve goals like this, to have a higher purpose than to solely provide entertainment or generate a profit. Because that's what COD the Big Red One tried to do. And I think it mostly succeeded. I just wish that every single person who played the game got to hear about the inspiration behind it.
Big Red One is the 1st Infantry Division, which I'm very proud to have served with.
Damn fine job, Sergeant. You do this division proud.
Got called back in that afternoon, and they sent word that he wanted to see me, and I thought, well, what am I going to get this time? And he told me to pack my barracks bag. I was going home. And I had a 45-day furlough. And I hit Kansas City on the VE Day, and it wasn't safe on the streets in Kansas City on VE Day because everybody wanted to buy you a drink.
But that's all I've got. If you liked this video, check out the video on screen now, because I think you'll like that one too. Thanks for watching.